Hello, and welcome back to our continuing interview series for the Margaret Chase Smith Library. Typically, you'll see Dr. David Richards, the director of the library, conducting these interviews. But this week, I will be doing it. I'm the museum assistant at the Margaret Chase Smith Library, and I'm also the state coordinator for National History Day in Maine. Now, if anybody is unfamiliar with National History Day, I'll give a little background to it. It is an internationally known program, and it's an educational program that encourages students to do independent historical research, and it's students in middle school and high school age. And then they present their findings to people in the field of humanities and get feedback to improve their projects. And the Margaret Chase Smith Library has been a part of National History Day for many, many years. Our director, Dr. David Richards, has been a judge for nearly 30 years here in the state of Maine. And it wasn't until 2014 when I became the state coordinator that the Margaret Chase Smith Library became a large financial sponsor for the program. And that is why I'm talking with you today, and that is because we are talking to some National History Day in Maine royalty here today, and we're going to talk about the program a little bit. I will say that aside from encouraging students to do independent historical research, I also want to point out that this is kind of like a contest-tiered system, and that's how the program works. So it usually starts where the students will usually create the projects at a school level, and then they will compete in possibly a regional level, and then go to a state level, and then possibly a national level, depending on if they're asked to move on. And the reason we are talking to Madison Albert today is because, like I said, she is NHD in Maine royalty because she is a two-time national winner for National History Day here in the state of Maine. And so just to run down a little bit of what she was able to accomplish and what she's done in the last couple of years. I believe her first year in National History Day, were you a sixth grader, Madison?
Yes.
Yes. As a sixth grader, she won a national award for a Women's History Award. So it was the best Women's History Award in the country. And then in 2016, an unprecedented thing happened. She won the award again at the national level, which I don't think has ever happened before or since. And then she did compete in 2017 as well and did make it to the national contest. Afterwards, she decided that she wanted to move on and work on some other projects and not do another History Day project after 2017. But we were so happy to still have her involved with the program, because then she became a co-coordinator for the state contest, and she worked with me on that and helped run that day. And then for 2 years at the national contest, she was my assistant and did a wonderful job of helping me organize and herd students throughout campus and throughout Washington, D.C. And so I just want to say that we are so thrilled to be able to talk with you today, Madison, and I'm glad you're able to find some time. So first of all, I'll stop talking and I'll let you talk a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit, or tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with NHD?
Yeah, so I just graduated from the Maine School of Science and Mathematics. I'm going to be attending Vanderbilt in the fall to study biomedical engineering. And
Can I ask you, how old are you?
I'm just turned 17.
Just turned 17 and just graduating and going to college. Just wanted to point that out.
And I started becoming involved in National History Day in middle school. So my GT teacher contacted me and one of my friends about participating in this program. So we had been identified for social studies gifted and talented, and up until that point there really wasn't a program at the middle school level for it. Mm-hmm. So our teacher decided that she would start putting us through National History Day. So she had already competed at a previous school, so she knew how the contest worked, but me and my friend like to say that we were completely ignorant to what it would entail when we first started. But it ended up being a really fun process, and I really loved the research and competing in the various levels, and so I continued doing it throughout middle school.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about your projects and the different types you had. I'll point out that in National History Day, every year there's a theme that students are supposed to base their projects on. And it's supposed to be a wide theme and a large net for students to be able to grab onto just about any topic that they find interesting. and then that way they can fit that into the theme. And so the first year, you were in 2015, the first year was Leadership and Legacy in History. That was that theme. And I believe your project was about Prudence Crandall, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about that project and what you found out about Prudence Crandall?
Yeah, so Prudence Scramble opened up she had owned a school for white girls in Canterbury, Connecticut, and one day one of her servants, who was African American, asked if she could join the school because she wanted to be able to go back to her own community and teach the girls there so that they would be able to find better jobs in Connecticut. So Prudence Crandall did this, and it was actually one of the first desegregated schools for a while, but as soon as the white parents found out that there was an African American girl attending the school, they pulled all of their girls out. So instead of kicking out the African American girl, Prudence Crandall reached out to William Lloyd Garrison, who, if you don't know, was the creator of the most prominent abolitionist newspaper at the time, and he helped her create a school for African American girls in Connecticut. And oftentimes we like to think that the North maybe wasn't so involved in racism and those sorts of things, but the town was very involved in trying to force these girls out. And they threatened them, they sent bricks through the windows, they set the school on fire. And so eventually, Prudence Crandall had to go to court against the town because they were afraid that these African American girls were like poisoning them somehow. And so her court case, although she did have to shut down the school because she was afraid for the girl's life, the court case was actually used in Brown versus the Board of Education to finally put an end to the segregation in schools. So this one small woman who had started a small school in Connecticut was able to influence this huge decision. And I thought that really showed the legacy of how small actions can really make a large impact in history.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I'm actually quite impressed that 5 years later, you were still able to remember all those details. So yes, exactly. You won like I said, you won the Women's History Award your first year out at the national level. And I want to show a picture, see if I can share my screen here, of you getting that award. Let's see, share screen. There it is right there. That is you at 6th grade Madison Albert. They're getting her award. That is in the Xfinity Center there at the University of Maryland in College Park, and that is where the University of Maryland Terrapin basketball team plays. And she was there with the executive director of the National Women's History Museum, who was the sponsor there. So that is your first year there. So we'll stop sharing there. And then you were able to, you've definitely had an interest in women's history, obviously, because the next year you also did a project connected to women's history as well, which was in the 2016. And this is the cumbersome year where the theme is I never could get it correct. So I have to look down at my notes here. Exploration, encounter, and exchange in history. Yes, that's it, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Exploration, encounter, and exchange in history. And you did it on Florence Kelley that year, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what did you find out about Florence Kelley?
So with Florence Kelley, I wanted to do a more unique spin on the theme because, you figured with a theme like that, you get a lot of like Lewis and Clark and that kind of exploration. So I decided to focus on Florence Kelley, who was actually very involved in creating child labor laws. Mm-hmm. It's not exactly what you would typically think of as exploration, encounter, and exchange, but her work to protect women and children in the workforce was really an exploration of these new ideas and policies at the time. And she certainly encountered much opposition and support through her exchange of ideas with the future generation. Mm-hmm. So I was able to incorporate it into the theme, even though it was a little bit less typical when you think of those words. And so with her project, I was actually able to interview her great-great-great-grandson, I think. And that was a really cool experience. It was one of my first really cool interviews, I guess, that was in person and with someone who is so connected to the topic. And it was really interesting to see how he had been impacted by her, and he's actually a lawyer. Oh, wow. So, and I was able to reach out to a couple of others of her descendants by mail and email. And I actually found out where she was buried, which no one, like only the family knows. That's one of those things where you can't actually put it on the exhibit, but it's kind of cool that, only a handful of people know that piece of information.
So why is where her burial site is? Why is that so secretive?
Well, she's not buried where people think she is, I guess, is kind of the thing, and it's unclear whether where she's buried they have actual permission for it.
Oh,
So,
gotcha. Okay.
yeah.
Interesting. Well, I mean, let's talk about that for a second. You were talking about that was your first real interview where you got as you're doing a lot of this stuff. So your research process when you're working on some of these type of projects, how do you start that research process, and where do you typically look?
Yeah, so I know my first year and my third year, I usually started in the library. I just went around the biography and nonfiction section, trying to find books that interested me and went from there. And I believe my second year, I did a similar process, but just on the internet. I was always trying to find a little bit of lesser known topics, so something that I could really become an expert on, whereas maybe the common people might not have as much knowledge on that same topic. So that always made it a little bit more interesting for me. So once I had found a basic topic, I usually go to books first. So find, just the basic context of the time period, as well as just the overall story of their life without getting too much into the details, just to understand, could this topic really relate back to the theme? So once I had that basic knowledge, that's usually when I started going into primary sources. And usually at this time, I'm reading the primary sources more just to understand, again, how does this all fit together and where does the theme come into play? And then once I've read enough of the primary sources, usually it's when I start developing the thesis statement. So that's like the argument that kind of connects everything together for your project, and it guides your whole, I did exhibit, so it guides the whole exhibit as I put it together. Then once I had the thesis statement, I would go back to the primary sources and find more if I needed for certain areas of the project that maybe I didn't have as much information on, and really go through them and figure out which of these quotes and pieces could help me support my thesis, and then where do they belong on the exhibit. And especially my first 2 years, looking for photos was a bigger part, because it's sometimes hard to find photos from the early and late 1800s. But on an exhibit board, obviously having those images is a big part of it. You can't have only text. So that was always a big part of the research too, is just trying to be creative with what photos I could find.
Well, I want to point out a few things. As you mentioned, especially how you connected Florence Kelley to the theme was a little interesting. And you being a previous judge now, and me judging for years, as well as being a state coordinator, I always found it interesting when students are able to make those stranger connections. And I always find that much more, I find that really impressive when students are able to dig a little deeper and think a little deeper about that kind of thing. But you mentioned that you did exhibits, and that is something that we should mention, that all 3 years that you were in NHD, you created exhibits. Now, there are actually 5 different categories that people can participate and present their work. So obviously exhibits, but there's also documentaries, papers, performances, and websites as well that students can create to present their work. So I just wanted to add that to it. But you're also talking about finding the primary sources and starting to dig in with some of that. What were some of the, like your more interesting sources that you were able to find as you did your work and your research?
Yeah, I think my first year, the primary sources that were really interesting were from the court cases, because it was very interesting to see how the Canterbury versus Connecticut case back in the 1830s, which was a fairly small localized case, and how that was reflected in the Brown versus Board of Education case, which was obviously such a large scale and impactful decision. And I think starting my second year, the interviews were always some of my favorite primary sources, just being able to see how someone really was able to impact either their descendants or other people in similar roles as them. With Florence Kelley, I also reached out to different people at like the different labor activist societies today, and it was interesting to see how they had been impacted by our work to do what they're doing now and to continue protecting people. So that was also very interesting to see how one person back in the 1860s, who didn't even see some of the first major child labor laws passed, is still influencing people to continue to create these laws.
Yeah, it's quite amazing to see like the long-term impact of your historical subjects sometimes, right? As you were doing a lot of this research and you're going through and working on your projects, was there anything that you found, aside from the secretive burial site, was there anything that you found that you thought was very interesting but you weren't able to put onto the board, onto the exhibit board, or that you wish you could have added that, but it didn't really necessarily not support, but didn't necessarily go with your thesis statements?
I've always wanted to put way too much on my boards. And when I first print out like all the sources and try to line everything up, I always have like 4 times the amount of material than I actually need. So I think every year I've had quotes and pieces of information that I just really wish that I could put on that, because of word counts and just the not trying to overwhelm people with too much text, just never ends up fitting. So that was always a problem for me, was just getting the text down to a reasonable amount.
I think that's a problem for any historian. So yes, yeah, absolutely. But I want to point out that I think it might have been your second year when you worked on the Florence Kelley one. I think your annotated bibliography that you created was like 130 some pages. Is that right?
Yeah, my second and third year were both over 100.
Wow. Right, so yeah, I mean, and that's something that sometimes I'll talk about when I do teacher workshops. And I will talk about your annotated bibliography, and I'll make a joke about how that is the same length as my master's thesis. So I always just find that really funny, that how in depth and how thorough you were with your research. But you also did another project in 2017, and you did, I believe, you came in first at the state competition. Is that right? You won first place, which the state competition is held at the University of Maine in Orono it's now at the end of. It's usually at the end of April, early May now, that we have regional contests. But you did it on the Danish Resistance, which was a little bit different, and you decided to not do something on women's history that year, right? Why is that?
Yeah, I didn't want to jinx them twice in a row. I figured that was close enough and move on.
Good idea, good idea. And so how did you get interested in the Danish Resistance topic?
So that was actually a Maine Student Book Award that year. There was a book on the Churchill Club, and it was told from basically a first-person account from the author had interviewed one of the surviving members.
Wow.
So I just found his story to be really compelling, and I decided that I wanted to really dive into that research and learn as much as I could about the topic. And I believe that year the theme was taking a stand. And so basically this group of high school boys, Denmark had just allowed Nazi Germany to just kind of come in without really taking any stand against them, so that they were trying to protect their people, but in doing so were obviously sacrificing their morals. And so this group of high school boys was just appalled by their government and what they were doing. And so they decided to take a stand against the Nazis and start performing acts of resistance. And eventually the Danish Resistance became one of the most well-known, but it all started from this group of high school boys. So it was very obviously taking a stand in my mind, and oftentimes in books they're kind of overlooked when you look at books about the Danish Resistance, even though they're really what started it all. Kind of a wake-up call to the government and the rest of their population.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, because I think sometimes when you think about resistance in World War II, you usually think about France, right? And there's a lot of the movements and the groups that were resisting in France, but you never do really hear about the Danish Resistance as well. So where did you get a lot of your sources? Because I mean, this was of course an international topic, so there probably wasn't a lot over here in the United States.
Yeah, so I actually reached out to a couple of different archives, libraries, museums in Denmark that I knew they had exhibits or sources related to the Churchill Club. And they were able to send me over documents, but they were all written in Danish, and not like modern Danish, but the kind of Danish that when you put it into Google Translate, like take a picture, it doesn't process it as words. So I was hand typing everything in to Google Translate to get it into English. So it was definitely a lot longer of a research process than I was used to, but it was very rewarding, and the sources were just really interesting to see the newspapers about their acts of resistance, or the police reports after what they had done. And people have been able to put it together and realize, oh, that was the Churchill Club's act of resistance, and connect the newspapers and the police reports and their own accounts. And one of the members actually has published all the letters that he wrote while in prison, and you can see all the lines that are blacked out when he was trying to send things to his family, and it's just very interesting. I was also able to interview the last surviving member. There were 2 at the time when the book was written, and the one that was interviewed for the book had since passed away. But I was able to interview Helge Milo, who was the last surviving member. He was in his 90s, but it was so interesting to see how it was still impacting him, these things that he had done. He was the youngest one at the time. I believe he was 14 years old when he started this resistance.
Wow. And so how were you able to get in contact with him?
So I actually reached out to the high school that they had attended, because I was part of my for my research for this, I wanted to show how the Churchill Club was still inspiring young kids today to take a stand.
Mm-hmm.
So I was hoping to reach out to a couple of high school students who went to their high school, who had heard their story, maybe had been inspired by them to take a stand of their own. And when I did so, they put me in contact with a couple of students, but they also said that they would ask Hal Jamilo to see if he'd be willing to interview me. So it was definitely a lucky situation there I was able to find.
That's really impressive. So yeah, were you able to, since you had to translate some of, well, a lot of your sources there, were you able to retain any of that information, or were you able to retain any Danish words or things like that?
Originally, not anymore, but at the time I definitely had days of the week down from doing all of the newspaper citations for the annotated bibliographies. I don't think I remember them anymore, but at the time.
So if you were able to travel overseas right now, you wouldn't be able to
No.
speak it very well. Yeah, well, I forgot to show my screen again, because I want to show a few more pictures here. So this is another picture. This is you winning your second national award, right? And this is with your teacher, Kathy, as well, who has been very successful with the Gifted and Talented program there at Greeley Middle School. And she's actually mentoring some students in the high school now as well. Did you ever serve as a mentor for any of the other students there at Greeley?
Yeah, so my freshman year while I was still attending Greeley High School, I had almost decided to do a project, but in the end I decided to focus more on my science and math and all of those competitions I was participating in. But instead I went down regularly to the middle school and helped the students with their projects. And that was a pretty fun experience to be kind of on the other side of it, when editing and helping them put together their ideas.
Mm-hmm. So what would have been the project you were thinking about doing your freshman year?
I was looking at the women's suffrage movement in Maine.
Oh.
So I wasn't quite sure exactly what side or part of it that I wanted to tell, because it's such a large topic, but that's where I was heading.
Oh, okay. And that would have, let's see, that would have been 2017. So it wouldn't have completely coincided with the centennial of the 19th Amendment, but that would have been, yeah. So you'd have been going back to the women's history theme again as well.
Yes.
So two more pictures I want to show real quick. This is, of course, of you and me down at the University of Maryland. This is your first year as my assistant, getting ready to run around. As you can see, we have Kermit in the background as well. This is us getting ready to start running around in the heat and trying to chase down a bunch of students and get pictures and give them words of encouragement. And of course, you helping out getting our seats ready for the national award ceremony as well. So, and of course, your teacher, Kathy Kearney, was the one who still provides those signs now. So for the national contest. But I wanted to show those as well. But you said something very interesting that I want to get back to, and that is being on the other side of it when you were talking about mentoring, things like that. You've been on the other side of it, of course, assisting me. And so you've seen how the MHD sausage works a little bit, or is made, and you've seen how we run a contest. But you've also worked as a mentor, but you've also were a judge this year, right? So
yeah.
how was that experience for you?
It was pretty fun to be able to see all of the exhibits and go through the annual bibliographies and process papers because usually when I was competing, it always stressed me out to look at the other projects. So I typically stayed pretty far away from the exhibit halls at the state and national competition, just to avoid some unneeded stress. I think it was really interesting to be able to actually see and look into all the exhibits really for the first time. And it was also pretty cool to just hear the judges interacting, but that's obviously a side that I've never experienced before. And sometimes judging can feel somewhat arbitrary, more at the higher levels, I guess, when everyone's so close together. I think it was really cool to see the kind of conversations that actually do happen. And of course, this year it was different because the student interviews didn't happen. And I think that would have been pretty interesting to see. But obviously, because of the situation, we weren't able to do that.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. And that was something that a lot of judges were sad about this year. That's one of their favorite parts, is to actually on contest day, students judges conduct student interviews, and they missed that part this year. So hopefully, if we have to do something virtually again, hopefully we'll be able to figure out the interview section part of it, and hopefully you'll take part in it as well, even from Tennessee. So speaking of Tennessee, let's talk about what your future plans are. So you mentioned earlier that you just graduated from the Maine School of Science and Mathematics.
Yep.
And you are getting ready to go to Vanderbilt. So how is that looking now that we're we're at the beginning of July? The fall semester is supposed to be starting here in a few months. Are you still planning on going to Nashville, or is this going to be?
Yeah, they said that they're planning on reopening. All the freshmen are going to be in singles, and everything's going to be completely social distance. Some of my classes will still be online, but they're hoping to have us on campus, and then we'll just stay there until November 20th, at what point they're sending everyone home. So hopefully that'll work. Even if I'm only on campus for a few weeks, I think that would really help with the transition, even if they have to send us home. So,
yeah. So I assume you're getting very excited.
Yeah.
Have you been to Nashville before?
I have once. I toured last summer before I knew that I was going to be graduating early. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And you enjoyed the city at all? Were you able to see some of the sights?
We weren't able to explore Nashville that much. I believe it was the same weekend as the Country Music Awards. It was pretty busy. So we mostly just stayed to Vanderbilt's campus and the near area, which isn't right in downtown Nashville. It's closer to some of the smaller areas where they're more locally owned shops and things.
Yeah. Well, you're going to be in store for a lot of great barbecue. That. And a lot of fun and interesting music down there as well. And I'll make one suggestion, that if you get a chance to either see a show or to tour the Ryman, which is where the Grand Ole Opry used to be broadcast from. It's a really cool venue. I was so excited when I went years ago to be able to stand on the stage there on the Ryman, where the Grand Ole Opry used to broadcast from. But so what are you going to be studying there in Vanderbilt then?
So I'm majoring in biomedical engineering, and I'm hoping to also major in math.
Yeah, there you go. So you are very interested in science, right? And so are you wanting to go into the medical field, correct?
Not necessarily. I think probably more the research side.
I'm sorry, more of the what side?
The research.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Related to the medical field, but not actually as a doctor.
Gotcha. So being someone who is definitely interested in science and biomedical and everything. So how did National History Day help you with your pursuit in science?
I think National History Day, especially at the middle school level, just really taught me so many skills that are used for everything. The first time I had to call someone just out of the blue to ask for an interview was definitely a rough experience. It was hard to get used to, just calling someone knowing that they didn't actually know who you are. But I think just through experiences like that, or just the writing skills that I gained, even just from basic grammar to being able to convey an entire thesis in 500 words on an exhibit board, really taught me how to express my ideas and how to communicate with other people. I think also the judging interviews were a huge part of that as well, just to be able to kind of stand your ground and explain exactly everything that you know, and have confidence that you're the expert on the topic, and be able to convey that to the judges. Also taught me a lot about just explaining my ideas and becoming more articulate. I think, yeah, all of those skills transfer over no matter what you're doing: math, science, history.
See, you're selling the program for me right there, and you're selling the idea that the humanities are important as well. So I appreciate that. Let's see if I have any more questions for you. Talked about your future plans, lessons that you participate in NHD. What are you currently doing right now? I mean, you're down in Southern Maine, correct?
Yes, I'm sent us back in March.
Yep. And so, are you planning when you head out to college? Are you flying out? Are you going to be driving out?
I believe we're going to be driving.
Yep.
Interesting.
Are you going to take any sights in on the way down?
Probably not. We'll probably just do a straight shot. We've driven to Florida a few times, so should be comparable.
I didn't know if you were going to try to see any historical sites as you went down that way. So, but it looks like we are at a half hour. So we have met our deadline there. So I want to thank you for taking the time to for this interview. And I want to thank you for everything that you've done for National History Day as a spokesperson for here in the state of Maine, and for being such a good representative and model for other students to aspire to. So I appreciate all your hard work, and I wish you the best of luck for your first year in Vanderbilt.
Thank you.
Yes. So I will go ahead and sign off, and we will be continuing this interview series some more here as the coming weeks go. So.